when we're talking about Minoans, the story probably starts with Sir Arthur Evans, who pretty much bought the ground on which Knossos was, the palace, the ruins of Knossos were excavated at around 1900, 1901. But of course, he also owned sort of the intellectual rights to these Minoans, which is through his full-volume work, The Palace of Minos. So, as an indication of his of the sort of the impact of this writing, it's worth noting how his predecessor, in his role as archaeologist in Knossos, John Pendlebury, reacted strongly against how difficult it was for him to write his own work on. This is reflected in a sort of memoir by one of the wives of archaeologist called Dilys Powell, and Pendlebury discusses how difficult it is for him to establish his own interpretation of the Cretans after Evans. It's difficult to sort of essentialize Evans's portrait of his Minoans in a few words, but he starts off his first volume on the Palace of Minos talking about how they were the archetype, or the sort of the first Western civilization. And I think this idea that that these Minoans represent a utopian or paradisical origin of Western civilization is perhaps the most important way, or at least what I'll be focusing on in this discussion. It's the most important way of thinking about his Minoans. And he was an enormously influential romantic figure for the younger generation. Mary Renault in particular was influenced by him and visited the Ashmoleum, and was captivated by various artifacts which he donated. And Laurence Durrell, who I look at also later, was a bit more skeptical, but was also reflects on his influence, on Arthur Evans' influence on this sort of construction of the Minoans. Okay, so let me go forward. So he's not the sole influence in 20th century this identity of Minoans. We also have some honorable mentions are Jane Ellen Harrison, so particularly well known for propagating the idea of an original matriarchy based in Crete, and this becomes enormously influential when you look at sort of reconstruction like Robert Graves's of the Minoans, and also Sigmund Freud, psychoanalytical interpretations of the labyrinth and the Minotaur become important as well, and this will be reflected in Laurence Durrell's text, which I'll look at later. So a good starting point if you're interested in this idea of modernist Minoans is Kathy Gear's Knossos and Prophets of Modernism. It's a very entertaining read, and I strongly, highly recommend that book as an introduction to the subject. Okay. So just to kind of give a rundown of different genres in which writers have discussed the Minoans, or tried to capture Minoan Crete, capture the idea of Minoan Crete. So firstly, probably we should talk about travel literature. Many of these writers, obviously the tradition of travel writing goes back into the 19th century, the Romantic tradition, and English writers were traveling to Crete and writing about it before. But we have a greater interest in Minoan Crete after Evans started popularizing his finds. And so, for example, I think Evelyn Wall mentions them briefly in his humoristic travel book Labels. He's a bit cynical about them. He doesn't quite agree with Arthur Evans's more utopian picture of these founding civilization of Western culture, he regards them as more sort of having a darker sort of side. Laurence Durrell also regards Minoan Crete as a place. I'll discuss an extract later where he talks about it from this book, as a sort of epiphanic place where the past can kind of reveal the future, a place of revelation. I've just started reading Barry Unsworth's travel book on Crete, so I haven't quite got to the section on Minoan Crete yet, but I browsed ahead and it does feature there as well. Okay, so travel literature. Also, they feature in obviously popularized classics. So, for example, Robert Graves' Greek myths, or Leonard Cottrell's Lion Gate. He also produced, that's mainly focused on the Mycenaeans, although the Minoans do feature quite strongly. And he's also got a later book which focuses exclusively on the Minoans. And more recently, Stephen Fry's book Heroes, which discusses the Theseus story. So are these representations sort of objective modern versions of the myth, or do they add in speculations? So Leonard Cottrell is particularly nostalgic to recapture in the 60s Evans' earlier model of the Minoans. Robert Graves gives quite an objective revaluation of the myths, but especially in his footnotes, we can see more speculation talking about the role of the moon goddess, etc., in certain throughout his reconstruction of the Minoan story, the Cretan myths. Okay. Then getting on to sort of fiction, literary fiction, if such labels are actually helpful. I'll talk about Laurence Durrell's Dark Labyrinth today. Minoans also feature strongly in Zorba the Greek by Nikos Kazantzakis, one of my favorite works. So there's, for example, one scene where the narrator visits the ruins, Minoan ruins on the island, and experiences some kind of epiphany or moment of realization. And they're present sort of obliquely throughout the novel. A plot spoiler: the death of the widow in the novel is sort of compared to the death of the Bronze Age Cretans and that sort of disaster. So there are references to Minoans throughout that work as well. And genre fiction, I'll be discussing Mary Renault's King Must Die and Robert Graves' 7 Days in New Crete today as well. So historical fiction and sort of science fiction, utopian fiction in the tradition of Wells. I'm not sure how much Robert Graves influenced Mary Renault. I assume he was an influence. I've been reading the biographies recently, but I haven't found a specific reference to him influencing her, but I assume she was familiar with the I, Claudius novel and his other work. And of course, in visual art, I'm not an expert, and Kathy Gear's excellent work on modernist Minoans is the one to turn to here. But on the bottom left is Ariadne by Giorgio de Chirico, and on top right is Minotaur Maki by Picasso. Okay. So yeah, why is Minoan Crete so interesting to writers, artists, and creatives across the 20th century? So there's various angles we can take in this. One might be sort of from the influence of Freud, looking at the potential for psychoanalytical readings of Minoan Crete, symbolizing a sort of lost realm of the unconscious, and we can talk about the importance of the figures like the bull and the minotaur and the labyrinth. So a good example of this writing, apart from Durrell's novel, which we'll look at today, is Agatha Christie's short story called The Cretan Bull, about a young man, I think his name is Hugh Chandler, who sort of descends into madness, and this madness is articulated through his sort of identifying as a bull, having dreams of himself as a bull and going mad. And I think Poirot even refers to him as being possessed by the Cretan bull or some such. I'm not paraphrasing exactly, but there's a comparison to that. And yeah, in typical sort of according to the conventions of the detective story genre, this idea of the irrational is debunked and there's a rational solution, and it turns out Hugh Chandler's father, he's actually a stepfather, has been slowly poisoning him, and so there's a happy resolution to that story. Okay, so psychoanalytical readings is one relevance of Minoan Crete 20th century writing. We can also talk about its relationship to feminist movements, as we'll see with Graves' story. And this obviously relates to Jane Helen Harrison's work on original matriarchies. Probably the seminal modern fiction, or what's called a poetic myth, is that of Graves' White Goddess. I've slowly started working my way through this. I prefer not to probably talk about it today. It's very, very complex, and I'm still trying to get the hang of that. Lastly, what Kathy Gear talks about, its general importance to modernism, if we can understand modernism as a single idea. Perhaps I could touch on irrationality here, the importance of the irrational in modernism, stemming from Nietzsche. And a good example of this is in Zorba the Greek. Zorba is sort of this anti-rational character who is opposed to the rationality of the narrator in that story. And yeah. Okay. So I'll be talking today specifically about how Minoan Crete is interesting as a sort of perfect locality, the realm of paradise or utopia. There's a certain sort of politics in how we use these words in utopian studies. So paradise generally refers to sort of rural landscapes governed by some sort of supernatural force, and being embedded in a sort of retrospective temporality, looking back. And utopia is it's more associated with science fiction, so less to do with pastoral landscapes, more institutional, urban, future-oriented. And again, sort of it's looking ahead. The memory is sort of it's progressive, whereas in paradise, the idea is that memory is sort of engages in restorative nostalgia, to draw on Boehm's phrase there. So it's embedded in sort of 19th century national memory with nation building and political agendas. Okay. So there's a history of seeing Minos' Crete. I'll rather say Minos' Crete rather than Minoans, because this is pre-Arthur Evans. Minos' Crete as a sort of civilizational paradise. Quoting from Dow here, for William Mitford, the historian, Minos is the very model of an enlightened monarch, both within Crete and abroad. Minos' power and influence abroad were based in the first instance on the efficient suppression of piracy, in seeing the importance generally of security for all in overseas trade. Okay, so we can see rather positivist reworking of Thucydides' famous sort of backhanded comment about the Minoan thalassocracy, about how Minos cleared the sea so that he could sort of put his own sons as sort of tax collectors over in various colonies. Okay, so we have a sort of positivist reading of this free trading thalassocracy. And on the domestic front too, Minos' important achievement was the creation of a highly advanced state at home in Crete, a state which in all free men enjoyed freedom and equality, a sort of classically liberal utopia in a sense. Okay, and this narrative carries on to Arthur Evans. So again, he regarded these, I'll say he's Minoans, sort of culture-bearing thalassocrats. So to quote from his first volume, Palace of Minos, it was certainly in pursuit of very solid commercial objects that Minoan or other Aegean merchants pushed forward into the West Mediterranean basin. There was a wholesale invasion of mainland Greece by Minoan forms, a sudden revolution involving the idea of actual conquest and settlement. The dominant element that now comes into view represents an incomparably higher stage of civilization than anything that had ever existed before on the Helladic side. Okay, so here we have the positivist sort of narration of civilization bearing goods to the colonized nations, and we have, I mean, that's particularly evident here in his idea of a invasion by form. So it's like the artwork itself is invading these countries, invading these lands for the better. Okay. So to head on to today's three writers, Mary Renault on the left, in the middle Laurence Durrell, and on the right Robert Graves. So I'll be talking how their imagination of this Minoan Utopia, Minoan utopianism, perhaps transcends these ideas of a civilizational paradise and takes new directions in 20th century writing. Okay, starting with Mary Renault. It's probably worth, as I started off, noting how she was very much influenced by Sir Arthur Evans. Her biographer, David Sweetman, writes, in matters of taste, Sir Arthur Evans was Mary's unwitting tutor. Okay, and she creates an ethnic portrait of the Minoans, which in many respects touches on Evans's characterization of these people as sophisticated and creating, advanced forms, etc. But the key difference is that her Minoan Crete is shown to be in an imperial sort of decline, at a late stage of moral decline, when Theseus, the hero, arrives there about halfway through the novel. The king must die, and so one of the Cretan characters says the golden age of the bull dance in Crete is a good while back now. So the idea is that we're at the end stages of this once golden age, this once paradise. And there are various tokens of decay in her characterization of Minoan culture from an original golden age preceding Theseus's arrival. So one indication is the leprosy of Minos himself. Minos gets a very positive characterization in Renault's novel. She generally depicts men more favorably than heroic men, more favorably than sort of mothers in particular, and women generally. And so Minos's sort of decay its disease is symbolic for the decay of the culture. I believe it's probably she's taken that from, I forget the name of the king, one of the kings, Crusader kings of Jerusalem, but the idea probably stems from that. And then we also have this very negative character Asterion, who's sort of orientalized, and he's a sort of late stage dictator. We have religious insincerity, so her Ariadne sort of fakes Epiphanes fakes rituals, and Asterion drugs the bull to win a bet. So we have sort of decline in religious sincerity and a decline in feminine rule towards sort of the masculine rule of Theseus and the subsequent sort of Mathenian or classical age, depending on how we interpret the novel. And so what are the reasons for Renault's sort of movement away from this idea of a hyper-civilized sort of utopia, which Evans initiated? Why did she depict Minoan Crete in sort of terms of a moral decline? Evans, I think at one point, when he characterizes Minoans as very pacific people, and it needed the catastrophe of an earthquake to suddenly end their civilization. So taking away responsibility for the decline from them, or perhaps of an invasion of Mycenaeans in other interpretations. But Renault puts the blame really on a moral decline among these people. So what is her reasons for this? So one simply might be that she's taken a stock Greco-Roman narrative of decline and inserted it into discussion of Minoans, fine. It also fits with the rise of Theseus. It works for a story. Then we also have this idea of history as cyclical in her story. So Theseus also has a rise and fall. And I think this is sort of fitting with her own sort of Mary Renault's liberal sense of anti-utopianism and individualism, that her novels really focus on movement and diversity and travel and gaining friends through other cultures, and the idea of a utopia was really sort of an anathema to her. And of course, she herself was living in a post-thalassocratic state. She migrated to South Africa after World War II, after a period of about 1950, after a period of intense austerity, which she experienced very badly in England. So this might also have resonances with her own situation, writing from outside the empire. Okay, so even though, let's check how I'm doing for time here. Yeah. So even though Renault is a bit sort of skeptical about this idea of civilizational utopia, she's still sort of captivated in her own experiences visiting Crete. So her biographer David Sweetman writes, the boat left with Mary still lost in spirit in Minos' labyrinth. When they docked at Santorini, she refused to go ashore for fear of breaking the spell, preferring to remain aboard and gather her memories of Knossos. So there's this idea that there's some kind of epiphanic experience to be there, some magical experience, breaking the spell he talks about. And so we see similar kind of experiences with other writers arriving at Crete around this period. So Laurence Durrell, in his work The Greek Islands, he devotes a long section to Crete, about 50 pages, discusses the Minoans quite frequently in his chapter, often quite critically. But he says here, its history is certainly more continuous and more revelatory than in any other island. It is more revelatory chiefly because of the discovery of the Minoan civilization and the brave attempt to date history backwards, almost into the Neolithic age. So there's this idea that you can uncovering the past, but also the idea of a revelation is linked to ideas of futurity, of discovering something new. So there's this idea that by going so far backwards into this unknown fragmented past, that we can discover something new. And this is whether of our present or the future. And this idea is also quite bluntly put by Barry Unsworth at the start of his travel book. So he says, I often use the past, sometimes the remote past, as a setting for my fiction. I find this distant focus liberating, clearing away contemporary clutter and allowing me to make comparisons with what I see as the realities of the present. So it's sort of a fusion, an interaction of past and present. This is probably one of the reasons why I have always liked Crete, the quintessential land of such fusions. Okay, so Crete acts as a place where the past and the present or the future can sort of be compressed. And I'll look at some ways now in which different writers, first Laurence Durrell and then Robert Graves, have imagined different futures, different utopias on Minoan Crete. I'm not sure how many of you have read Laurence Durrell's The Dark Labyrinth. He didn't regard it as his top work. He was quite critical of it later, regarding the Alexandria Quartet as his major work, and to a lesser extent the Avignon Quintet. But it was quite positively, it has received some more critical reception in subsequent years. And so just to give a brief plot outline, it centers around a diverse set of characters on England who sort of become part of this Mediterranean cruise to Crete, and they sign up for this tour of a labyrinth. And their tour guide initiates a rockfall, and they get trapped in a labyrinth. Several of them disastrously die. Some of them escape, and this is the story basically. So it's got several typical Durrellian themes, such as death, self-deception, has focus on sort of the spirit of the place, and so forth. And the novel itself can be read in various respects. So on the one hand, it does seem to be just a satire on English manners. So he was quite antagonistic towards sort of his English identity, and regarded himself as sort of an expatriate, or sort of having a mixed identity, having been born in Himalayas, near the Himalayas, and then having gone to England for his schooling, and then later moving to around the Greek islands. So he also regarded himself as an expatriate, and he referred to England as Pudding Island, famously. So in one sense, the novel is kind of a satire on English manners and outdated ways of thinking. And this is sort of evident in the character of Greichen in the novel. It's also quite cynical or pathetic about the Minoan explosion in archaeology. So there's an archaeologist, Axelos, who is sort of a trickster, medial character. He's bisexual, and he tricks Greichen, who's sort of an Arthur Evans type character, and so plays on this idea that of the Minoan reconstructions all being faked. Excuse me. But it's also it can be read as a sort of psychoanalytical quest of interiority towards a type of utopia. Perhaps an ontological utopia, maybe a Buddhist utopia. Okay, let me just, next slide. Okay, so the novel starts off by describing characters with various sort of psychological disturbances, self-deceit himself about his own death. Kind of, he's terminally ill, and he pretends as if everything's normal. Another character is sort of morbidly obsessed with his own death, Firmax. Another character, Miss Dombey, is obsessed with sort of proselytizing a very Christian worldview, which Durrell is against. Okay, so we have characters with various psychological disturbances. They move away from England. Importantly, they're pushed together by a psychoanalyst called Hogwarth, who's sort of described as a minotaur by Durrell. So the newcomer lowered his grizzled Taurian head and started towards him, Greichen, with all the caution of a big man who fears that he will overturn something, so like the bull in the proverbial china shop. So he pushes all these characters towards the labyrinth, where they're lost, and they have to come face to face with their own psychological demons. So for Greichen, this is the realization of his own self-deception. For Miss Dombey, this is realizing in Freudian terms that her love of Jesus is really just a misplaced love for a father. For Firmax, it's his realization of his own sort of morbid fascination with death, which leads him to even choose his own death. Etc. There's about 7 different characters. But most interestingly for the topic today is the successful passage through the labyrinth leads to a kind of mountaintop or alpine utopia. So it's this physical paradise, which is described in typical utopic terms. It's isolated from the rest of Crete. It's just sort of surrounded by impassable mountains, and these 2 characters, Mr. and Mrs. Truman, are sort of stranded here, having worked their way through this psychological labyrinth. And in this physical utopia, they meet an old lady who's been herself stranded there for several decades, I believe, and she kind of articulates a certain sense of being, which we can think of as sort of perhaps a Buddhist utopia, a utopia removed from anxieties, perhaps some sort of pure ontological utopia. Importantly, this character, I forget her name, does not sleep, so she's removed from sort of psychological distress, which was experienced in the labyrinth. So she sort of moves through that gauntlet, and she's reached some transcendental sort of state. So this is apparent in one of the important final parts of the novel. So she says, I remembered how life was before. I was outside everything in a certain way. Now I participate with everything. In my own mind, inside, not as something I think or feel, but as something I am. Inside there, I no longer prohibit or select. The things you were telling me, Mr. Truman, about the growth of the state as a concept and the beginning of social conscience. All this is only a detour, a long and vicious detour through material amenities towards a happiness that will continue to elude men so long as they continue to elude themselves and each other. Okay, so there's a criticism here of sort of social utopianism, whether it's communism or socialism or whatever, whereas she's endorsing a type of pure being, removed from anxiety. Okay, and Durrell later in life became, I think, more and more interested by Buddhism, and I think there's some discussion of in his biography of him perhaps being reborn as a cultivator of the vineyards in France, where he spent his later life. Okay. If I have some time, I think I do have some time to talk about Robert Graves's. Yeah, I do have a bit of time. I've worked through this quite quickly. So I'm talking now about Robert Graves's 7 Days in New Crete, sort of a science fiction, in a genre of science fiction, utopian literature. So the novel is in the first person narration. The narrator is a poet called Edward Van Thomas, and he's it's actually not in Crete itself, it's in southern France, but we're several epochs ahead in the future. Okay. So what's interesting is that Graves self-consciously references Crete. An Israeli Sophocrat named Ben Yeshu wrote a book, Critique of Utopias, from a detailed and learned analysis of some 70 utopias, including Plato's Timaeus and Republic, Bacon's New Atlantis, and so forth. Huxley's Brave New World, and the various works of the 21st to 24th centuries. He traced the history of man's increasing discontent with civilization as it developed and came to a practical conclusion. We must retrace our steps or perish. So here we have this idea of retrotopia, going back in time, to go ahead in a sense. So what are some of the features of Graves' retrotopia? So we sort of the converse of Mary Renault, which tracked from matriarchy to patriarchy. History is going in reverse, and we're going from a patriarchy, a Zeus-governed state, back to a matriarchy. This is kind of key to Graves' literature and also his sort of life experience. He was apparently inspired, according to his biographer, by Jane Harrison, also by first wave feminism. His first wife, Nancy, was a feminist, and he was very much influenced by that. And then obviously we don't want to get into the whole Laura Riding years, and the influence on him of that. Okay, so we have from patriarchy to matriarchy, a feature of his retrotopia, and also there's a movement from a thalassocracy, Evans' idea of sort of culture-bearing civilization back towards an isolated golden age. So his Cretan thalassocrats are also sea-bearing people. They go out and they try to share their culture, but they find it to be too corrupting and they become insular. So it's sort of an inversion of that culture-bearing logic. Okay, but his Crete is also, in addition to being a sort of matriarchic, retrotopic utopia, it's also a poetic utopia, and so here he's reacting against Plato. So this fictitious scholar Ben Yeshu pointed out that no writer of utopia had ever applied himself to make good the damage done by Plato when he banished poets from his Republic and preached scornful indifference to poetic myth. So here we have Graves' emphasis on poetry and anti-rationalism, anti-science in his utopia. Okay, so I think I'm gonna stop there. I actually went through that much quicker than I thought, and yeah, I'll wrap up there.